Hello, everyone, and welcome to our third annual Security Challenges in Latin America Forum. And before we get started, I just wanted to cover one quick administrative note. We are offering simultaneous interpretation to Spanish, which can be turned on by clicking the little global icon on the bottom right of the screen. Buenos días a todos y a los que prefieren escuchar el evento de hoy en español. Sí estamos ofreciendo interpretación simultánea. Solo tiene que presionar el botón en la parte inferior a la derecha de la pantalla, que hay un icono que parece como el mundo, y eso te va a cambiar el idioma a español. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome again to the Sison Perry Center Third Annual Security Challenges in Latin America. This year, as everyone can see, we're conducting this forum completely virtual. And while it's given us our own set of challenges, to include my worry of whether or not Comcast cable will go out, it has given us an opportunity for more people to attend without the physical limitations that we've had over the last couple of years. Last year, for example, we did it in the Kenny Auditorium at SICE, and we maxed out with 120 people. But as of this morning, we've had 540 people register for the event, which is really a testament both to the enthusiasm and interest everyone has on specifically this subject and the region. So just a little background, we set out to create this forum 3 years ago to create a space for Latin Americanists, people from the region, people who are interested in the region, to come together under the banner of two incredible institutions, both Johns Hopkins University's SICE and the Perry Center's Hemispheric for Defense Studies, which is part of the Department of Defense. And really to discuss and share ideas on issues involving the security and defense sphere in the region. So the model we followed over the last couple of years is one where we try to develop a theme that we focus on throughout each of the panels. Last year, our theme was analyzing whether institutions were ready to respond to the mounting security concerns in Latin America. And those are both institutions in Latin America as well as in the US. This year, we've decided to tackle a different theme and instead look at Latin America and its role in the wider global context, hence the name of today's theme, Latin America and the World Order, Stepping Up. Now, the world is undoubtedly more connected and the roles Latin America play today are increasingly more important. However, a looming question kind of remains. Should, and if so, how, can the region play a larger role in this new, more globalized and increasingly polarized global platform? So why focus on Latin America now? Well, Latin America is more important than it was previously. The aggregate economy of Latin America and the Caribbean was just 1/3 the size of that of the European Union in 1990. And today it's approximately half the size. And China has also increased its attention in the region and has become Latin America's second largest trading partner and replaced the US as the largest trading partner in Brazil, Chile, Peru, and Uruguay. In the meantime, the global order as we know it and as it was defined after the Second World War is evolving. What that order looks like in the future and in the upcoming decades largely depends on the actors involved in redefining and influencing its form. Now, there's a limited opportunity for US to foster and bolster Latin America's role, but more importantly, there's an opportunity for the region to really step up and help define the future global architecture that benefits the region more than anything else. With that in mind, to analyze this overarching question, we've set up 4 different panels to understand specific elements of the question. Our first 2 panels are going to focus on current regional obstacles that could limit the region's ability to play globally. The first panel, we've titled Political Order and Disorder, Implications for Regional Security and Cooperation, which is going to take a look at the recent political turmoils that have plagued various nations in the region, and then to understand how those effects might affect both internal security, but more importantly, regional cooperation. The second panel, we have titled In Sickness and in Health, Regional Health Security. Now, it's impossible to take a hard look at the region today and its future globally without first analyzing the most pressing emergency, COVID-19. However, this immediate concern also highlights a longer-term potential problem in the region, which is overall regional health security. and what the long-term implications that has in the future of the region. Similar to the debt crisis, which affected the 80s, there's a potential for health security to affect this upcoming decade, and we want to analyze that. For the last two panels, we'll focus on answering the questions of Latin America in a more kind of global context directly. The third panel we've titled Far and Away and So Close, Regional Dynamics and the Great Power Competition, to directly analyze the region's role in this new competition, what's its relationship both individually as countries, but also as a region within the great power competitors. We'll follow that up with a keynote address, which we're lucky to have the former Minister of Defense of Colombia and the former Colombian ambassador to the US, Juan Carlos Pinzón, who will bridge all these panels and give us his thoughts on the overarching theme for Latin America and his perspective as a Latin American on this overarching theme. He'll be introduced by the director of the Perry Center, Lieutenant General retired Frederick Rudishan. And then for the fourth panel, we decided to look towards the future for opportunities where Latin America can have a more influential role in the global stage. For that fourth panel, we've titled it Pressing On and Powering Up, Climate Change and Energy Dynamics in the Region. And as the title suggests, the focus is on looking at the importance climate change and energy have within the region, and more importantly, the potential for the region to become a global voice for those issues. On a personal level, I look forward to everyone's thoughts throughout the day, and we encourage people to please ask questions. There'll be a Q&A chat window during each of the panels, which will help expand the conversation and make it more interesting. So at this point, what I'd like to do is introduce Dr. Scott Tolson, the Dean of the Perry Center, to provide his introductory remarks before we get started with the first panel.
Thank you, Jim. Good morning. On behalf of the Perry Center, I would like to thank SAIS for co-sponsoring this forum and for hosting this virtual event. I would like to welcome and to thank all of you who are joining us from across the Americas and indeed the globe. I want to thank both Lieutenant Colonel Jim Marquardt and Dr. Fabiana Sofia Pereira, who have taken the lead in organizing today's event. The Perry Center is located at National Defense University in Washington, D.C. On behalf of the Department of Defense, our center focuses on defense and security in this hemisphere. We do this through education, through outreach, and research. We work across 4 programs: defense governance, human rights and the rule of law, cybersecurity, and combating transnational threat networks. We also have initiatives in other areas such as women and peace and security, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, and great power competition. We have a vast network of over 6,000 alumni, and they constitute our center of gravity. It is an honor and a pleasure to work with SAIS for the 3rd time on this. The Perry Center and SAIS share much in common, including the fact that they take their names from their founders. The Perry Center was named after William J. Perry, a mathematician and engineer who served as Secretary of Defense. SAIS takes its full name from Paul H. Nitze, who worked at the highest levels in the Department of Defense and the Department of State. These visionary leaders, though born 20 years apart, were committed to shared values, such as the importance of 1, public service, 2, public-private collaboration, 3, interagency coordination, 4, education, 5, the practical application of theory to the problems of today, and 6, international cooperation in search of a more just, prosperous, and peaceful world. It is those shared values that join us today as we focus on security challenges in our hemisphere. Those challenges are vast and complex and require frameworks and solutions that cut across disciplines and borders. I want to thank all those who are participating as panelists and moderators today. We are in for a treat. In closing, muchas gracias, muito obrigado, thank you. Jim, back to you.
No, thank you, Scott, and I appreciate that. Well, so it's time right now to go ahead and roll right into our first panel, which today, the first panel is going to be titled Political Order and Disorder, Implications for Regional Security and Cooperation. Now, but before we get started, just two quick administrative notes for those who are just now signing in time for this panel. First, we are offering simultaneous interpretation into Spanish. You just have to click the global icon on the bottom right of the screen. Para los que están interesados en escuchar este panel en español, sí estamos ofreciendo interpretación simultánea. Nada más hay que presionar el botón que parece como un globo en la parte, como el mundo, en la parte inferior a la derecha de la pantalla, y lo va a cambiar al español. Second, and the last administrative note, is we are going to offer a Q&A session. It'll be through a Q&A chat window that'll appear for people to go ahead and write their questions in. We encourage that you add your name and organization when asking the question, just to get a better context of where the question is coming from. So at this point, I'd like to introduce a good friend of mine, an accomplished academic, and also one of the professors at the Perry Center, Dr. David Spencer, who has vast amounts of experience in working in the region. He'll moderate this upcoming panel. So Dr. David Spencer, please, over to you.
Thank you, Jim. It's great to be here. As Jim said, I'm Dr. David Spencer. I'm one of the Perry Center professors, and I'm obviously the moderator for this panel, Political Order and Disorder Implications for Regional Security and Cooperation. You know, it's interesting that, you know, our security policy in the hemisphere has always been based on cooperation. You know, in 1941, so at the beginning of World War II, we formed the Caribbean Defense Command out of the Panama Canal to develop an alliance against German incursions against U.S. shipping in the Caribbean. In 1947, we developed the Rio Treaty for Mutual Defense. And then finally, in 1963, we established the United States Southern Command. These various commands and treaties have sought to develop cooperative solutions towards the resolution of defense and security challenges in the region. These efforts have experienced various levels of success over the years, and this cooperative approach continues to be the cornerstone of U.S. defense and security policy in the Western Hemisphere. To discuss the current challenges to cooperative approaches, we have three distinguished panelists with us today. I'm going to introduce all three of them now, and then cede the rest of the time to them. First, we will hear from Dr. Paul J. Angelo, who is a fellow for Latin American Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations. His work focuses on U.S. Latin American relations, transnational crime, violent actors, military and police reform, and immigration. A former active duty naval officer, Angelo has extensive experience in military and government service. Among the things that he's done, and I'm not going to read them for everybody, he deployed to Colombia 3 times during his career and was in charge of interagency operations along Colombia's Pacific coast. He's a graduate of the Naval Academy at Annapolis and has a PhD from the University College of London. He will provide us with some comments about general trends in the regions, as well as Central America and Colombia. We will then hear from Dr. Cynthia McClintock, who will discuss Peru and the Andean Ridge. Dr. McClintock is Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at George Washington University and is Director of George Washington University's Latin American and Hemispheric Studies program. She holds a bachelor's degree from Harvard University and a PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And most importantly, she was my thesis advisor. So it's great to see you again, Dr. McClintock. Dr. McClintock has been the president of the Latin American Studies Association, has been the chair of the Council of the American Political Science Association's Comparative Democratization section, and has been a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center, International Center for Scholars. She has a forthcoming book on electoral processes. Finally, we will hear about Venezuela and part of the Southern Cone from Dr. Javier Corrales. He is a Dwight D. Morrow Professor of Political Science at Amherst College in Amherst, Massachusetts, where he has worked since 1996. He has a Bachelor's of Science in Foreign Service from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, and a PhD in Political Science from Harvard University. He's been a visiting lecturer at the University of Amsterdam, a Fulbright Scholar at the University of Los Andes, and the Javierana University in Colombia. And in many other impressive parts to his curriculum. We have from now until 10 a.m. for this panel. Each speaker will make a statement for about 15 to 17 minutes to discuss their topic, and then we will throw the balance of the time open to questions and answers. Paul, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks a lot, David. And thank you to SAIS and to the Perry Center for this invitation, and a special thanks to Fabiana and Jim for the invitation to join you. As David said, I will start with a sort of a brief survey of general trends, political trends across the region. It would be difficult for you to make those comments without framing that discussion in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has had far-reaching and dramatic political, economic, and social consequences, especially for Latin America. And then it will briefly set the scene for some of the countries that I spend a lot of my time thinking about, those of the Northern Triangle of Central America and Colombia. So as for most of the world, 2020 was a bad year for Latin America and the Caribbean, but for many people in the region, it was about the worst year in memory for them. Lamentably, Latin America and the Caribbean region represent among the worst affected regions of the world vis-a-vis COVID-19 in absolute terms. The region comprises a mere 8% of the world's population, but 18% of the world's COVID cases and 27% of the world's COVID deaths. And that's not including the 330,000 excess deaths in Mexico, which were reported last year, which would suggest systemic underreporting in the region's second most populous country. And as it has here in the United States, COVID-19 has laid bare the public health and governance deficiencies across the region. Even for middle-income countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, hospital capacity and testing capacity has been considerably lower than other middle-income countries across the globe. And in terms of actual vaccines secured on a per capita basis, many countries in the region were very late to the game and are lagging behind other middle-income countries across the globe, and certainly are well below the OECD average for vaccine distribution. Indeed, most countries in Latin America and the Caribbean will not see widespread vaccine availability until 2022. And some countries like Peru and Bolivia will not see widespread vaccine availability and administration until the first quarter of 2023. We've already observed in any number of countries from Peru to Argentina, scandals over the administration of vaccines, the prioritization of partisans of the ruling party or wealthy residents of these countries before frontline workers, which again sort of lays bare the systemic nature of corruption and elite privilege across the region. And for that reason, I would start, and I hope that we can continue to discuss this throughout the next hour and some change, that what is at the core of instability and the sort of one of the main political and social challenges for Latin America is that trust in government is at an all-time low across the region. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw an unprecedented wave of social unrest across Latin America, everywhere from Central America to Colombia to Chile. In the most dramatic case in Chile, we saw that President Piñera was even willing to go to such great lengths as rewriting the constitution in an attempt to quell the fury over social inequality in the country. And so it's in this context of anger and inconformity that we've seen an acceleration in any number of trends, from the rise of populist authoritarianism to disinformation to democratic backsliding. And per the latest Latino Barometer polling, less than half of the Latin America Caribbean region believes that democracy is the preferred form of government. In the same poll, respondents suggest that they like democracy in theory, but when asked about their own experience with democracy, most Latin Americans are dissatisfied today. Against this backdrop of political malaise and a public health crisis, Latin America has also experienced the most significant economic contraction globally in 2020. Regional GDP contracted by 7.7%, countries like Peru, Argentina, possibly Mexico saw GDP contractions in the double digits, and their recoveries for 2021 are going to be nowhere near as robust. Over the past year, we also saw about 40 million Latin Americans slip back into poverty after decades of poverty relief and lifting people out of poverty and into the middle class. Unemployment increased in the region by 2.5%, putting the number of job seekers at over 30 million across the region. And that is that kind of desperation for employment and the ability to be able to put food on the table has pushed people to do things like migrate, of course, which is something that we've certainly discussed in the context of Mexico and the Northern Triangle, but also to join the ranks of the region's vast criminal networks. And in fact, gang recruitment is up in places like Central America, largely as a consequence of a downturn in remittances for part of 2020, but also because of the inability of people to secure meaningful employment. In this context as well, given an economic recession, governments will be forced to cut budgets and to seek loans, which will further deepen public debt in countries that are already heavily indebted to creditors. For 2020, and this is something that was mentioned in Jim's initial remarks, China has not actually extended any new lines of credit to the region for the past year, but China has sought inroads in Latin America, Caribbean region over the past decade and a half. And I suspect that in 2021, we will see some renewed attempt to reposition China as an economic and diplomatic competitor to the United States in the Latin America, Caribbean region. In fact, we're already seeing the attempts on part of the Chinese government to woo Latin Americans with access to vaccines. And even in the earliest stages of the pandemic, it was the Chinese government that was ahead of the ball curve in administering and surging PPE and critical medical equipment to many of the countries in the region, including those who have longstanding and positive ties with the United States. And so, although we can expect the major governments of Latin America and the Caribbean to rebound economically this year with a projected growth of about 4.1% GDP, many of the countries, the smaller countries of the region, the Caribbean countries, the countries of Central America, which are largely dependent on tourism, are going to struggle to bounce back this year due to travel restrictions, which remain in place for many of the countries of the region that have especially fragile public health infrastructure. And on top of that, you have a region in which many of the countries have more than 50% of their populations employed in the informal economy. And these individuals were significantly affected by lockdown measures. And so the best prognosis in economic terms for the region is that GDP per capita will not rebound to pre-COVID levels until around 2025. And the path that the countries of the region pursue to get to that point, to get to a pre-pandemic stasis in economic, political, and social terms, is going to be defined by any number of electoral contests that happen in 2021. In presidential elections, we have Chile, Nicaragua, Ecuador, Honduras, and Peru. There will be legislative elections this Sunday in El Salvador, and later in June in Mexico. And to the extent that we can talk about an electoral process in Venezuela, Venezuela will hold subnational elections later this year for gubernatorial and local political offices. And so again, that's sort of the broader macro panorama for 2021 in Latin America and the Caribbean. But now I will redirect our attention to a couple of the countries that I spend a lot of time thinking about, those of the Northern Triangle of Central America. And when it comes to US Central America relations, we've seen a very early interest on part of the Biden administration, particularly as it pertains to helping address the root causes of migration from Central America. This comes as no surprise to anyone who's been paying attention to Joe Biden's career, because as vice president for the last 4 years of the Obama administration, President Biden served as the de facto envoy of the Obama administration to the Northern Triangle region and oversaw the administration of more than $750 million in US assistance to help the countries of the region address the root causes of migration in the wake of the 2014 child migrant crisis. And so I think we're going to see the Biden administration seek to engage governments of Guatemala, Honduras, and and El Salvador on migration early on, as was suggested by a spate of executive orders focusing on irregular migration from the Northern Triangle. But the Biden administration is going to have a difficult time of finding cooperative partners amongst the executive leadership in the three countries that I mentioned, because they are facing any number of internal pressures that may, and even international pressures that may constrain their behavior vis-a-vis the United States. When it comes to Guatemala, the Biden administration took the reins just as Guatemala was deciding on the composition of its constitutional court, replacing a magistrate who had passed away. And the legislature in Guatemala has voted to install a judge who has been implicated in a major influence peddling scheme. This follows on the heels, of course, of the Guatemalan former president, Jimmy Morales' decision to eliminate the international anti-corruption body backed by the United Nations, known as the CICIG, but reinforces the sense that elites are once again trying to buy court decisions and trying to buy off the judiciary in Guatemala. This latest, the latest uproar over the naming of Judge Moto to the Constitutional Court has accelerated the pace and frequency of protests, which began in the fall when Congress approved emergency budgets that sought to axe pandemic assistance programs while also raising perks for legislators themselves. And it's against this backdrop of popular dissatisfaction and unrest that the Biden administration is going to seek to reduce irregular migration from Guatemala. When it comes to Honduras, Honduras has been all over the news, in fact, this week, because on February 8th, federal prosecutors in the United States announced that they'd begun investigating Juan Orlando Hernandez, who has been in power as president in Honduras for the past 7 years. This is coming on the heels of his being named a co-conspirator in his brother's drug crimes last year. And the United States has also investigated any number of other top officials in his government, to include the Attorney General and top brass in the military and police, who have all been implicated or accused of conspiratory action in drug trafficking or money laundering. And just earlier this week, a group of influential Democratic senators proposed legislation to sanction Juan Orlando Hernandez and to revoke security assistance from Honduras. Again, much like was the case in Guatemala, we had for several years operating an OAS-sponsored anti-corruption and anti-impunity body in Honduras called the MAXI, which brought under investigation some 120 people, including 70 individuals who were active government officials, many of whom had deep and close ties to the president and his inner circle. And unfortunately, looking forward, even if the U.S. government is able to sanction and isolate President Hernandez in his last year in office, as I mentioned in my initial comments, Honduras is going to be having a presidential election later this year, and none of the leading candidates inspire any real confidence that their values align with those of the Biden administration, which will make bilateral relations rockier than they have been in recent memory. One of the major candidates is an individual by the name of Yanni Rosenthal, who is a convicted money launderer who spent 3 years in prison for his criminal activities. And the two leading candidates for the National Party to take the reins from President Hernandez are Tito Esfura, who is a mayor of Tegucigalpa, who's linked to a major embezzlement scandal, and Mauricio Oliva, who has historically been President Hernandez's right-hand man, who has also has suspected ties with drug cartels. And then we get to El Salvador. El Salvador, 2 years ago, we had President Bukele, who was elected, and Bukele represented an opportunity for the US government in the Northern Triangle, because he had campaigned on, and in the initial months of after his election, had presented himself both to his electorate and to the United States as an outsider who wasn't associated with the corruption of the Flores or the Saca or Funes governments that preceded him. His anti-corruption mantle was attractive to the United States and indeed to the international community writ large. as he sought to voluntarily introduce to the country what was known as the CCAs, similar to the CICIG, but a UN-backed anti-corruption and anti-impunity commission for El Salvador. However, Bukele in the interim period has demonstrated populist authoritarian tendencies and has weaponized social media and to include sort of public funds which help craft a narrative about him and about his governance. And in fact, he's used public funds, it's suspected, to contract lobbyists in Washington, D.C. To help mold the perceptions of Bukele here in Washington, D.C. And now he's riding a wave of popular approval and support from security forces to trample checks and balances in the country, silence dissenting media, and consolidate power in the legislature. And as I mentioned, there are legislative elections in El Salvador this Sunday.
2 minutes.
And so it's likely that we will see Bukele consolidate power and maybe gain an unqualified majority in the legislature, which would allow him to tweak or make modifications to the Constitution. And right now, in terms of public opinion polling, because of a significant reduction in violence in El Salvador, we've seen his public approval sit above 85% for much of the past year. And he has a 91% public approval rating when it comes to his handling of the COVID-19 crisis. And then finally, comes to Colombia. I think it's always best to look at Colombia from where we sit here in Washington on a bilateral basis. And the president of Colombia, President Duque, has demonstrated a remarkable pragmatism in the first months of the Biden administration. He was the first leader in Latin America, Caribbean region to reach out and publicly congratulate President-elect Biden, which was important in the wake of suspicion and accusations that his party, the Centro Democrático, and people who are well placed in his party were campaigning, in fact, on behalf of President Trump in the 2020 election. But domestically, President Duque is facing major frustration over his own COVID vaccine rollout. Colombia just this past week got its first doses of the vaccine and has so far administered them to less than 0.1% of the population. But he's also facing incredible pressure because of the demographic pressures of Colombia's housing 1.7 million Venezuelan migrants or refugees within its national territory. This past month, we saw President Duque unilaterally take a very charitable act to curry favor with the Biden administration and do the right thing by Venezuelan migrants by attempting to extend a sort of a temporary protected status to Venezuelans who are currently in Colombian national territory. But again,
Time's up.
Demographic pressures are happening against a backdrop of an armed conflict that continues apace. In fact, just this week, we had 2 soldiers who were killed in an IED incident placed by the ELN in the outskirts of Cúcuta. The Clan del Golfo is engaged in a plan pistola in the Urabá region. And again, we've seen over the past several years, year after year, a rising number of human rights defenders and social leaders being killed. And so it's against that panorama that we can continue the conversation in the question and answer period. I defer back to Dr. Spencer.
Thank you, Paul, very much. And thanks for staying close to your time. Dr. McClintock, I understand you're going to share slides. If you could go ahead and do that. Okay, you have 17 minutes.
Well, thank you so much, David. Are the slides appearing there correctly, or do they have the, do I need to go to the full screen there, or is that okay?
You probably need to hit your presentation button at the bottom.
Okay, like.
I don't see it on the screen.
Right, well, maybe we're okay as we are.
Yeah, I mean, you could scroll down through them and I think it'd be all right.
I'll see. Well, first, good morning, everybody. It's great to be here, and no, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about Latin America in these such challenging times, and in particular to talk about Peru. I want to first also say it's great to see David again. He mentioned in the introduction that I was his dissertation advisor, but it's been a while since I've seen him, so it's great to see him. Paul mentioned that it's been a disastrous year for Latin America, and tragically, that is probably more truer in any country than Peru in the region. And I want to highlight today both how far Peru came from 2000 to 2016, and then also the tragedies of the last couple of years and the problems of the last couple of years. It was really a remarkable turnaround. Peru had always had many, many challenges. It was always one of the most unequal countries, much political turmoil, but 2001 to 2016, these were great years in Peru, and they led to Peru's playing a very positive role in the hemisphere. Now, and this is something that perhaps Paul didn't highlight as much because he was trying to cover so brilliantly so much of the region. But when the countries are focused on all their internal problems, it's very difficult for them to be positive players in the hemispheric order. So this was the democratic stability that remarkably Peru achieved from 2001 to 2016. 4 presidents freely and fairly elected, virtually no questions about the electoral process until 2016. Really broad respect for political rights and a very, very vibrant investigative journalism. This is, I think, one of the key backstories in the Peruvian context. Investigative journalism came to the fore. If you could imagine almost any country in the world in which the 6th most powerful person is an investigative journalist. Gustavo Gorriti was the head of an NGO that worked tirelessly and without fear to investigate corruption, to investigate other kinds of wrongdoings, working closely with the media to make sure that got out. So when we get into the story about the corruption in Peru, it's in good part due to the vibrancy of this civil society, the media, that obviously has a lot of the problems that every country in the world has today with social media and falsehoods, but also managed to get out the story about corruption, wrongdoing that is a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, it meant that people are aware of this and are saying this has got to end, but on the other hand, it meant that democracy was discredited. Peru grew dramatically from 2001 to 2016. As you can see there on the slide, the best average GDP growth in South America, second best in Latin America during that period, but growth with equity, remarkable improvements in equality. 4th best in Latin America in terms of improvement of the Gini coefficient, 3rd best in Latin America in terms of the reduction of poverty. So, of course, as in every country, there were hopes for even more, better, and there's lots of debate within Peru about, it should have been more, but overall, this was a remarkable achievement. And as I mentioned at the start, Peru's economic success, political success enabled it to be this constructive player in the international order. It, I would argue, was highlighted, especially for Peruvians, by the resolution of a long simmering dispute with Chile. I think we here in the United States tend not to talk much about all the border conflicts that have been ongoing in Latin America for decades that kind of, we were pretty confident these were not going to erupt into more serious conflicts. But in Peru, that was never so clear. There are always these resentments against Chile. The fact that this went to an international court, that the decision held, it was a very, very pleasant surprise for Peru. Peru began to interconnect with so many countries around the world economically, signing a free trade agreement with the United States, becoming a member of the Pacific Alliance. That was a economic pro-market agreement for Peru, Chile, Colombia, and Mexico that has now kind of been pretty dormant, but for a while there was a lot of hope in that grouping. 14 free trade agreements, more than any other country except Chile. And then the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Some of you will remember an Obama administration initiative for economic integration among Asian countries and Latin American countries, with a hope that this would kind of either sideline China or bring China along under rules of the West. So Peru was a part of that. So a very active player in that sense. And then very important role in hosting international fora. So this was the 2014 United Nations Climate Conference. As you know, this is held annually. This was its turn in Latin America, with Peru hosting the conference. And then the Lima Group, some of you remember, this is, this was a major effort to try to restore democracy to Venezuela, with most of the Latin American countries signing on to a pretty firm position, supporting Juan Guaido and the opposition to Maduro in Venezuela. And the Summit of the Americas, 2018, Peru is the host. Martin Vizcarra, who'd been newly restored, brings off an important summit. So that was the really positive international implications of Peru advancing as a positive player in the world. And what was really remarkable about Peru's achievements during this time is that it had been a country that had been extremely, extremely troubled. So it shows these countries can turn around. Some good things happen. It can turn around. As I mentioned, Peru is long considered one of the most unequal countries in Latin America. It was the home of the Incan civilization, one of the largest, most sophisticated in Latin America outside of Mexico. So even more, Ecuador, Bolivia, the other Andean-rich countries, they're all countries racked by very, very severe cleavages by class, by ethnicity, by geography. But Peru, arguably the most severe. This is Peru's famous novelist, two nations that don't like or trust each other, but are condemned by history to live together. So this was a very, very difficult past for Peru to overcome. Terrible, terrible years in Peru. I'm sure many of you here will remember the Shining Path insurgency, which racked Peru for more than a decade. Savage as it was, the Maoist cult, it yet challenged the state. There were periods in which it was not at all clear that the Peruvian state was going to survive this challenge. I'd say, one of the really interesting and unique features about the Sendero tragedy in Peru was that it was overcome through the capture of the leader. That meant when we're talking in Colombia, El Salvador about peace agreements, the kind of political legacies of an insurgency in Peru, because the leader was captured, the movement was decimated. It endures today, but as a drug trafficking organization in a very remote part of the country. So it is not really a player in any sense in the country. A horrific death toll. 70,000 people were estimated to die. The photo on the left is the leader, Abimael Guzman, and the photo on the right is how Peruvians remember this after Guzman had been captured, and then the horrific death toll. So it's interesting to compare, what Sendero meant in Peru relative to other Latin American countries that did not endure such an insurgency during the 1990s. Ecuador and Bolivia, now, as you know, experienced a sort of a pink tide when the left came to power in 2006. But Colombia and Peru, where the insurgencies much more tainted the left, raised much more questions of the left, that didn't happen. And nor did an strong indigenous movement emerge in Peru, because at the time when indigenous movements were becoming powerful in Ecuador and Bolivia, Sendero was occupying that space. And Sendero was not interested in ethnicity as a banner in its movement, which was unusual, but it wasn't. And so indigenous movements did not emerge. And of course, that has left big, big imprints on the politics in the country, because those movements did not come to power. At the same time, we have to highlight that there were concerns in Peru that, in part because these pink tides didn't come to power, no leftist party kind of consolidated itself, and Peru's parties were fragmented. We see in Ecuador and Bolivia, Colombia, polarization. In Peru, it was no parties could really get a hold of themselves, could really build and endure. They fragmented. So very low trust in political institutions. Carl mentioned that trust in democracy is very low throughout Latin America. This is, as you can see in the graph there, that is very, very true in the case of Peru. So when did things begin to go from this stellar movement forward, backsliding? In 2016, the election was very difficult. First, a candidate who was surging in the polls was disqualified only a few weeks before the election. The victory by Kaczynski, PPK, as he's called, was extremely narrow. Because it was so narrow, the runner-up was very angry and fostered gridlock and obstructionism for several years. And then the Odebrecht scandal broke. And could you tell me, David, how many more minutes I have here? Just to...
You have 4 minutes.
4 minutes. Okay, thank you. The Odebrecht scandal broke. And this, as you probably hear in all the headlines about Peru, there's been no country in Latin America that has seen this kind of instability over the last couple of years. And all the past presidents, plus Keiko Fujimori, the runner-up, being implicated in corruption. Alejandro Toledo for a bribe for a highway, Alan Garcia for a bribe for the Lima Metro, Humala for campaign finance, taking unreported campaign finance, PPK, also business dealings when he had been minister, Keiko Fujimori also campaign finance. So one issue was all of these presidents being charged, all the presidents being perceived as guilty, but also very, very slow wheels of justice, that none of these people, it's now been 3 years and none has been actually tried and convicted, and yet they're in pretrial detention for months. So obviously there's lots of questions there. And corruption is just a major, major concern. This is the Latino Barometer survey, where Peruvians, more than people in any other Latin American country, are saying, we've got to stop this. And Vizcarra, who's the vice president for Kaczynski, he takes up this anti-corruption battle because Peruvians are furious, and it works for him. He has several showdowns with Peru's legislature, and he prevails. And this is the very first one. You can see Nilo de Ratas there. Is the Peruvians believe the Congress is full of crooks. They want it gone, and they support Vizcarra.
2 minutes.
Yeah, and but these allegations of corruption catch up with Vizcarra himself, And this 1 week in November, again, this is virtually unprecedented in recent decades in Latin America. 3 presidents in 1 week. Vizcarra is surprised, is impeached, is a shock because he's got immense popularity ratings, which is because of his anti-corruption efforts, which, it's like, why would you do this? We haven't had a popular president in several years and we're getting rid of it. And then worse yet, the Congress speaker is perceived to be a political hack, and huge protests. I mean, I have been in Peru for many years. These were by far the largest protests since the 1970s. Perhaps most interestingly were Chile, Colombia, Bolivia, protests around injustice, inequality. These were protests for democracy, people saying, no, this is not democracy. This is not what we want. The sign there, Fuera Ratas, is out with the crooks. He's a coup monger. He is not my president. Fortunately, the Congress comes around next time for a centrist, someone who can be respected, Francisco Sagasti. But he faces these tremendous, tremendous challenges. Again, Paul is talking about how hard COVID-19 has hit Latin America. It's hit Peru, arguably the worst of any country. Often Peru is at the top of the charts of Johns Hopkins of the worst fatality rate.
Time.
If you remember, 5, 3, what is it?
Yeah, your time's up. Your time's up.
Okay, very, very quickly. So even more deaths than during the Shining Path insurgency, just awful. The worst economic plummet in Latin America, huge job losses, problems with insecurity. And then to top it off, last week, and this is not a problem exclusive to Peru, but this question of the purchases of doses of vaccine from China. And clearly, China was enabling extra doses, quote unquote, extra doses, which were put into the arms of the people negotiating these agreements. So obviously, big questions, basically, are they bribing the ministers who were responsible for the charges? Interestingly, the competitors here were not so much the United States companies as Russia. Sputnik was the likely alternative. But all of this with elections due very, very soon. And one of the biggest problems, I think, right now, I mentioned the 2016 election with the front runner being disqualified. The current front runner is also, at this moment, disqualified. He is appealing that. We'll see. There is a possibility of a victory for the left. But lots of candidates, and given this scenario, obviously it's very difficult for these candidates to campaign. None of them have more than 10% of the vote. So the conclusion is, this Peru is a cauldron. Much questions remain, doubts remain. I wish I could be optimistic. I usually think of myself as an optimist about Peru, but at this moment, it's very hard to be an optimist. Thank you. I'm sorry about the time.
No, you went over by 30 seconds. Anyway, if you'd stop sharing your screen, because Javier also has slides. Javier, go ahead and share your slides. There we go.
Here we go. Okay.
Yeah, if you go to the, I was told if you F5. Oh, you go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. You can do that. Oh, good. Excellent.
Okay, great. I would like to begin by saying thank you so much to SAIS and the Perry Center for the invitation. I feel humbled to be sharing the Zoom window with Cynthia and Paul. Great presentations. I also want to say, Fabiana, it's so good to see you. It really brings me so much joy to see how much you've done since way back when you were taking a class that I was teaching at Georgetown. Really delightful to see you again. Thank you for having me. What I would like to do is I was asked to discuss Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, Nicaragua, and Chile. And what I want to do is to organize my points on the basis of the problem of dealing with the three prototype regimes that we have in the region. I'm going to discuss a very democratic country, Chile, a little bit like Peru, the problems and challenges that we see in Chile as a democratic nation in its effort to renew its democracy. Then we're going to look at two semi-authoritarian regimes that still linger, that are in flux, and we don't know where we're going. And I want to say something about the problems associated with semi-authoritarianism at this juncture. And then, of course, talk about Venezuela and Nicaragua as our solid authoritarian regimes. They have graduated from being semi-authoritarian and are fully authoritarian. So let's visualize this diversity of regimes. So I'm going to start by talking about democratic backsliding in the region, and then talk about Venezuela and Nicaragua. Then I'll do Ecuador and Bolivia. And then I'll talk about Chile. But think about that I'm actually, even though I'm talking about countries, I also want to make sure that you understand that I'm talking about regime types. So let's look a little bit at democratic backsliding in the region. Democratic backsliding is a term relatively new in political science that has been created to understand a type of authoritarian regression that is somewhat different from the traditional fashion. The traditional fashion was that there would be a democracy and either insurgents or the military would overthrow the democracy. Democratic backsliding refers to efforts by the president, him or herself, democratically elected, to erode democratic institutions. And the world has developed a number of measurements to track this, to see how this is going. And I'm using one of them. It's called VDEM. Some of you might be familiar with it. It's very new. And this is the Liberal Democratic Index. And this index ranges from 1 to 0. And 1 would be a very liberal democratic country. And 0 would be, oh, I don't know, very few countries are 0, but think North Korea. Liberal democracy means that you have free and fair elections, but also a robust system of checks and balances and enormous and sufficient guarantees for competitive politics with the opposition. So these are all the countries that have experienced democratic backsliding. So the way to read this chart is these are drops. Think of like stock market figures, stock drops. So this is, for example, let's do the first one here, is Poland from 2012 to 2019. It started here, highly democratic, and by 2019 it has dropped all the way here. So democratic backsliding most likely applies to this category of countries because they started relatively democratic. This other category, that's probably autocratic consolidation. Let's find some countries that are familiar or of interest to us. The United States has made it into this unpleasant chart, not a big drop, thankfully, but it is experiencing a little bit of this. There is a lot of discussion about what is going on there. I want you to notice some of the most serious autocracies that we have gotten, but I want you to notice the case of Venezuela, which starts out as still relatively democratic and experiences one of the deepest drops in the world. So it's not just that there's democratic backsliding, but it really, really dropped. I also want you to notice that we have Nicaragua here. It started out less democratic than Venezuela, but they have reached comparable levels of undemocraticness. And then I want you to notice, of course, our good friends Bolivia and Ecuador, who started on this path, but thankfully have not dropped as much. And this is why we might call them semi-authoritarian, because they haven't come all the way down in this index. And I agree with this classification. Some of you may disagree. I am sure that the leaders of these regimes in Bolivia and Ecuador would disagree and say that the country has never been more democratic. But I happen to agree with what I'm showing you. And so notice also that Chile isn't here. Chile in almost in none of the indices that are produced to track democracy appears as experiencing democratic backsliding. So it's not in this one, and that is a great thing. Let's hope that it lasts for a while. Okay, I hope this is clear. Let me now begin to talk about the problems of our good old authoritarian regimes, Venezuela and Nicaragua. And of course, this could apply to any authoritarian regime in the region. Now, what is happening here is that the conventional notion that we need to negotiate a transition to democracy is likely to fail. It's always hard. I think it's always hard, but in Venezuela and Nicaragua, it's especially hard because the incumbents have the most to lose in this opportunity. And also, they have learned from the past never to negotiate an exit, because in the case of Nicaragua, it proved incredibly dismal for Ortega in the 1980s and early 1990s. He never really quite recovered electorally from that, and so he had to cheat his way back into power. And in the case of Venezuela, because they listened carefully to the Cuban model, which is a model of you just hang on and resist. But it's a little bit more complicated than that, the reluctance to liberalize. Because let's now focus on Venezuela. In Venezuela, you have, one could argue, 4 key elements to the incumbent party structure. That's the military, civilian leaders, criminal gangs, and the base that vote for the ruling party. And they all are terrified of a transition. The military is absolutely convinced that a democratic administration is going to purge the government of military influence. Civilian leaders know they're going to end up in jail. Criminal gangs are very afraid of what the return of the DEA would mean to them, which is what would happen with the transition to democracy. And the base, which is really shrinking, so I don't think that this is so important anymore, but it is still there, have enormous fears that whatever social gains they obtained under the boom times of this authoritarian regime are going to disappear, are going to be taken away, that there's going to be a sort of distribution. So if you think about it, this makes it almost very difficult for any inroads to happen here. And so the other major complication is, of course, that the opposition is declining. Cynthia discussed how quickly Peru's democracy began to unravel after 2016. In Venezuela, what we're seeing is the unraveling of the opposition in almost a year after becoming very, very strong. And so they might come back, but we cannot count on the opposition any longer playing a strong pressure on the regime. And again, the idea both in Venezuela and Nicaragua is let's not repeat the mistake of Gorbachev of liberalizing significantly and conceding, because we will lose everything and we will be in deep jeopardy. So what has happened here is that these are regimes that I guess the best that one could get out of it would be some tweaks in the regime, some policy changes, some improvements in some laws and some institutions, but the question of regime change seems to be blocked at the moment. And this is going to present the most serious challenge for the Biden administration, because how do you then engage with these regimes? Somehow the Biden administration may end up, and I'm not saying that I like this, but the Biden administration might end up having to also relax the goal of regime change in these two countries. Maybe, we will see, but it's definitely facing a wall, and a hard wall for that matter. Moving on, let's talk about these semi-authoritarian regimes in flux. You know, at the risk of equating them, I just want to make sure that since there's a risk of equating two countries that are very, very different, let me begin by saying that they are in different moments in where they are with semi-authoritarianism. I think that under Correa in Ecuador, the country became more autocratic than during most of the Evo Morales period. The Evo Morales period became more undemocratic towards the end. But what we're seeing under Ecuador is, for whatever faults of the Lenin Moreno administration since Correa left office, is a bunch of signs in the direction of democratic renewal. The left is focusing on the non-leftist policies of the Moreno administration. They are there. There's conversation with the IMF, for example, a greater turn to the market as another example. But there is also a significant degree of less confrontation with civil society, more openness, greater freedoms. Lenin Moreno is not running for office. A significant opening to the press, let me repeat that, and a big effort to try to stop corruption. And this has also, as in Peru, implicated previous presidents in Ecuador, because Correa was such was a player for such a long time. There aren't that many former presidents to go after, so a lot of the brunt of the anti-corruption efforts have fallen on Correa. Now, let me just switch to Bolivia for a moment and say that Bolivia, of all these authoritarian regimes that I have discussed, probably had its best run economy. So in that sense, it had a little bit of what Cynthia was describing, a boom period under semi-authoritarianism, economically speaking, with a significant degree of equity and also a sense of indigenous empowerment. And so it had two aspects that are pretty positive of its semi-authoritarian period, economic growth with equity and indigenous empowerment. And so this makes the semi-authoritarian regime of Bolivia and the party that brought it to Bolivians a bit more appealing. So whereas the semi-authoritarian the party that brought semi-authoritarianism to Ecuador is weaker. Nevertheless, both face the possibility of a return of the direction of semi-authoritarianism. And let me say something about a topic that those of you who know me know that I have been studying for a while, which is the eternal problem in Latin America, and especially in Ecuador and Bolivia now, of ex-presidents. The leading candidates in Bolivia, there was an election in 2020, and the winner was a person directly chosen by Evo Morales, the intellectual author of the semi-authoritarian regime. And in Ecuador, the front runner in the presidential elections, still we're waiting for the second round, is Correa's hand-chosen person. There was a time when there was a tradition in Latin America, exemplified by Mexico, in which ex-presidents would choose successors. That's okay. I mean, that wasn't great, but but they would follow the Mexican model, in which the ex-president would retire and grant significant autonomy to the successor, and that's over in Latin America. What we're seeing over and over again from Bolivia, Argentina, all the way now to Ecuador, is these former presidents trying to exercise enormous influence. So we're going to have to watch what's going to happen, whether we're going to see puppet governments or whether we're going to see a civil war between these presidents and their patrons. One interesting thing I want to say about the Correa successor, el Delfín de Correa, is that He's very young, absolutely amazing, a little bit like El Salvador's president, but very technical, very much an economist. On the left, there you have it, amazing English. Go to this interview from February 16 in Democracy Now!, a leftist medium, and he has a wonderfully appealing technocratic mind. And so it sounds like it might be a variation rather than a continuation of Correa, but that's to be seen. All right, let me hurry up and say something about Chile. Chile has been the star of the region, in part, not entirely, because of the stability of its two major poles. The left and the right have created coalitions, and they have maintained a certain degree of stability. And instead of the coalitions going to extremes, which is the problem of the United States, the parties tended to go towards the middle. And there were a number of explanations for that. And that, I think, has a lot to do with Chile's rise from being the basket case up until the 1980s to being an amazing performer. There's a risk of this model collapsing. I'm going to say not high, but the parties are in turmoil, and it's not clear that the coalitions are going to hold together. There is a significant degree of anti-partidocracia, which we saw in Venezuela before the party system unraveled, in El Salvador before the party system unraveled, in Colombia before the two-party system unraveled, in Uruguay before the two-party system unraveled. And we don't know where this is going to go. It could go very far. May I have one more minute?
Sure.
This effort, anti-partidocracia, is going to have an opportunity to play a role in the constitution that they are going to be reforming. We don't know how far this anti-partidocracia movement will take the constitution, but the constitution may result in a big change in politics, perhaps more so than in economics. And so we're here to watch. Chile is in the process of trying to produce democratic renewal. That's one of the keywords in my main slide. But we have studied these efforts at democratic renewal going too far in undermining some of the institutional pillars that were responsible for some good outcomes. We will see. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you all. You've done a masterful job of taking very complex subjects and putting them into very short presentations. I was amazed at how many slides Cynthia was able to go through in 15 minutes. Anyway, we have some questions. Let's go ahead and take them. The first question here is for Paul Angelo. It's from Adolfo Enrique Santos Guzman from Dominican Republic. And his question is, I will read it because he wrote it in English. How can we effectively reduce budget on the relationships and foreign policy of security with regional cooperation in the American continent and specifically the Caribbean? Anyway, I'm not exact. I guess what he's asking is how does reduced budgets impact the relationship in terms of security and regional cooperation?
Great, thank you for that question. And I would just say that, I think that because we're in a time of real fiscal austerity and there aren't a lot of resources to go around and the magnitude of problems continues to increase, the countries of the region are going to be forced to fall back on something that has long been a mechanism in the region, and that's multilateralism. And I think many of the countries in the region have been heartened by the initial language coming out of the Biden administration in this regard, that the Biden administration seeks to defend democracy, pursue an anti-corruption agenda across the region, and to confront common threats and common problems with shared solutions. And so, everything from migration to transnational organized crime to public health crises like COVID-19 and climate change, these are things that countries across the region, to include our own country in the United States, we're dealing with. And I think that the need for countries in the region to recur to organizations or mechanisms like the Pan American Health Organization, the Organization of American States, has increased going forward. I would say that the United States government as well has an unprecedented opportunity, knowing that it will play host to the Summit of the Americas later this year in Miami, to set out this agenda and to start to corral, once again, regional consensus after 4 years of democratic backsliding in the United States and elsewhere in the region under the Trump administration, to build consensus around the issue of democratic consolidation in the hemisphere. Moreover, I think there's a new opportunity in the aftermath of the Petro-Caribe scheme. Now that the Venezuelan government is no longer able to corral votes within the OAS by subsidizing oil exports to the smaller countries in the Caribbean and Central America, I think we have an opportunity here in the United States to help bring Caribbean countries into the fold and once again reinvigorate sort of a longstanding tradition of cooperation on areas of mutual interest.
Thanks, Paul. This next question is from Sonia Winter. I'm going to ask it to Cynthia because it deals with Peru. Cynthia, where do you consider Peru is on the democratic backsliding scale? Cynthia?
Yes, thanks. I would say it has slipped as of 2016 from sort of upper 2/3, upper 3/4 among the Latin American countries. I mean, in part because it did not have the historical legacies of democracy that Chile, Costa Rica, Uruguay did, and in part because of this problem of political parties. No, in part because of the problems that, dissatisfaction with the parties meant that these parties could not grow. Now, if they're not popular, they can't grow and survive. So there are always questions, but in terms of political rights, civil liberties, until 2016, it was very strong. The disqualification of a candidate in that 2016 election, just as he was surging, and I always thought he had been very likely to win, was a big question mark. And I don't think, VDAM, Javier referred to that, the other kind of ranking agencies, I think they've had a hard time what to do with, okay, the election is pretty much all right, but there was this, but to me, it was a significant, issue. Now, I mean, the one hand, we have protesters vigorously prevailing, right? Which is, I think the vast majority of people looking at Peru, the fact that Manuel Merino, by everyone accounts, a party hack, was not able to consolidate a more authoritarian regime. This was a big plus. These protesters were peaceful. They're, again, asking for democracy. This is how it should work, right? And how it should have worked in Venezuela decades ago. So that was good news. But amidst this turmoil and throw the rascals out and these doubts, I mean, the support for democracy in Peru is rock bottom. And then, as I was mentioning at the end, these big concerns about this upcoming election. Can it be legitimate when the candidates can barely campaign? There are going to be questions about voter turnout. There are going to be questions about the poll watchers. There were questions in Ecuador, right? I mean, this is sort of going around the world, including the United States. Okay, if we call it a fraud, well, and then again, possible disqualification of the front runner. This is, I was heartened to hear kind of the expectations that Paul was mentioning for the OAS. I hope that could be true, but I've seen no signs of election monitoring in Peru by any kind of hemispheric institution, the OAS. In 2016, the OAS came out quite strongly saying, no, this is a technicality. You're disqualifying the front runner with a couple of weeks to go. So far, nothing. I think everybody has become very self-absorbed, and for this kind of what's seen as a minor question to come to the fore. So I'm very nervous that very nervous that Peru could slide back significantly. No one would be seen as legitimate, and we could see continuing turmoil, which.
Yeah, it's not a good picture. Okay, here we have the next question from Ryan Keating. I believe this is Ryan, who is my former intern. How you doing, Ryan? This is for Javier Corrales. Before discussing the potential unraveling of the two-party system in Chile, you mentioned two examples of negotiated transitions that are informing current regimes. Was Pinochet's transition in the late 1980s not another example? And if so, what lessons have current regimes taken from this case?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Why don't I play a little bit with the Chilean comparison to talk about the problem that we're having in Venezuela and Nicaragua. One of the factors, there were two important factors that contributed to convincing the Pinochet regime to step down. One was the fact that the United States was pressuring them, and the Pinochet regime needed to be aligned with the United States, whereas Venezuela and Nicaragua have discovered that they don't need the United States. So the bargaining leverage of the United States is much weaker in Venezuela and Nicaragua. But the other factor is that in Chile, the Pinochet regime thought they were going to win the plebiscite. They felt, to use political sandwich jargon, electorally competitive. So this is great because when you feel electorally competitive, then you decide, okay, let's have a competitive election. I'm going to win. Pinochet overestimated mildly his competitiveness. He almost won, but he was competitive. And so this is the plan that we have in Nicaragua and Venezuela. The ruling parties in both countries know that they're no longer competitive. And therefore, they are terrified of free and fair elections. They know that that'll be the end of them. So they may be much more interested, perhaps, in doing in wanting something like Colombia in the peace agreement, which is some kind of subsidy to them that during this period in which we are electorally uncompetitive, you have to treat us even better than you would treat any electoral loser. And this is a very hard thing for the opposition to grant, as it is anywhere. It was very hard for Santos to agree to it with the FARC, and it is very difficult for the opposition to say, oh, we not only we want to get rid of the Chavistas and the Orteguistas, Murillistas in Nicaragua, but during the opposition, you guys are going to have special consideration. This produces a difficulty that blocks the transition in those countries. But I appreciate the opportunity to make comparisons with other cases. Thanks.
Very good point. Here's a question for Paul from Alejandrina Sanabria from El Salvador. I'm going to translate. She wrote it in Spanish. I'm going to translate it in English. It says, hello from El Salvador. I would like to know what your opinion is in terms of the condition of my country and its management of the pandemic.
Great. Thanks for the question, Alejandrina. I would say that President Bukele was among the leaders, not just in Latin America, but in the world, to take the earliest and most decisive action in trying to prevent the pandemic from arriving to El Salvador. Many of you may recall that back in February of last year, El Salvador was already closing its borders, was shutting down air travel to other countries, nearly a month before the United States took similar decisions. And so I think that Bukele, part of his appeal and part of his continued popularity was his having sort of been on the right side of history in making those early and decisive decisions. However, if you look at the curve for the spread of COVID in El Salvador, I mean, it does really peak around the summer of last year, as it has for much of the world. In comparative terms, El Salvador has fared significantly better than the other countries of Central America, especially Nicaragua, which has been long underreporting COVID contagion and COVID deaths. But it's really hard to evaluate a country's performance on COVID and whether or not that's a product of political decision making. Because if we look to what Cynthia was saying, I mean, Vizcarra took early and decisive action in containing the COVID-19 pandemic, yet Peru has been the most affected country in absolute terms by COVID-19. in deaths per capita in terms of its economic contraction over the last year. So what I would say is that, I think President Bukele is very good at selling his message to his own country. And it's again, because of his savviness when it comes to social media and his ability to sort of manipulate the narrative as a good populist does, that he's given the significant favorability in recent public polling for his COVID-19 response. Thanks,
Paul. So here's a final question. We have quite a few now, but we're running out of time. This last question will be for Javier, and it's about Ecuador. Do you and it's from Javier Espinosa. He wrote it in Spanish. So I'm going to translate it into English. Do you consider that for the second round in Ecuador, the accusations of having received financing from the Colombian ELN to the Arauz candidate will have an impact on people's vote, that they will change their mind in terms of who they're going to vote for?
It probably played a greater role in the first round. What Arauz demonstrated is that the Correa brand is damaged on a number of fronts. And so that accusation, I don't know if it's true or false, but it's part of all the accusations that are levied against the Correa administration. Now, for the second round, I think people are going to begin to think about other matters. They're going to begin to think about what's less bad, a return to Correa or Lasso, who is an unproven candidate, but is associated by the left, which in Ecuador is not a small sector, as representing sort of like the ancian, the old Ecuadorian aristocracy, and so we will see. In the second round, it's going to be very hard. I think the key issue is, of course, what the non-Correísta left is going to decide to do. The non-Correísta left is intensely anti-Correísta. It's not like, they're intensely anti-Correísta. It is Yacu Pérez denounced Maduro, supported the removal of Morales in Bolivia, hates Correa, but it's on the left. And it's going to be very hard for them to form a coalition with Lasso. It's very disputed. So I think the issue now is going to be, let's watch what Yacu Pérez and this non-Correísta left is going to do.
Okay, we actually have 2 minutes left, and I'm going to give one more question to Cynthia. This is, again, from Ryan Keating. Says, one of your research focuses has been on the positive democratic effect of runoff elections. Has the past year, with its backsliding in runoff countries such as Peru, impacted your thinking on the issue, and if so, how?
Well, thanks again for the question. I think runoff has been very positive and continues to be very, very positive. I've been thinking just about what Javier said with respect to Ecuador. If there were not a runoff, would the left feel it hadn't had a chance to kind of make this decision between two candidates that it's not crazy about, that it's better that it reach that decision, kind of come to terms with this in some fashion, because when either Lasso or Laos wins with less than 50%, this question of where would those votes have gone, who would have gotten the majority, who would have gotten the popular support. Obviously, this is a question back in the Bolivian election, because there's a tendency, of course, in Latin America for parties to divide. So whenever the parties are divided, there's this big question about, okay, what would that other 30% or 40% of the electorate have done if they had had the chance? So I think in this time, perhaps more than ever, the need for the legitimacy of these candidates so that they can avoid the Peru situation of, we don't really like this guy at all. He's not our president, right? So you need to have majority so that this person is going to have a terrible time or she's going to have a terrible challenge anyway. So at least that they have a majority and can say they had something bordering on a mandate so that they can govern. In the case of Peru, 17 candidates, it's very likely that the two finishers for the runoff will have like 25% each, 30% each. So I think it remains key.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Javier, for an excellent panel. And now I turn the time back over to Jim.
Hey, thanks, you know, Dr. Spencer, thanks a lot for moderating the panel, and also, you know, on behalf of SAIS and the Perry Center, you know, really a lot of thanks to the Dr. Cynthia McClintock, Dr. Javier Corrales, and Dr. Paul Angelo. You really expanded the conversation. I wish we would have had more time, but I think everybody is very thankful. And so that concludes this panel, and we'll be going on a small little break from now until 10:15. After which we will then move on to our next panel, which is starting at 10:15 in sickness and in health, regional health security. So thank you very much, and I'll see everyone in 15 minutes.